Hi everybody, I'm Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we're going to look at the difference between caching and tiering. We see these a lot in hybrid storage systems, and today they're becoming more and more popular rapidly. But a lot of people don't understand exactly how they differ, and they differ in important ways. So let's look at what makes them different. So first of all, let's take a practical, real-world means of creating both of these. The most common scenario is to have an underlying storage array that is relatively slow, relatively meaning compared to the tiers above it, and that will normally be spinning disks, traditional Winchester hard drives, because they're high capacity and low cost, but they're not very fast compared to everything else we might use as storage technology. The next tier up, or the cache layer, depending on how you look at it, is generally made up of something, it's always made up of something faster. It is generally made up of something like solid state drives or flash drives, and these are more expensive for the same capacity, but give a lot more performance. In some cases, we might have another tier or cache layer, which is made out of something like RAM, which is extremely fast compared to the layers below it, but extremely expensive for the same amount of capacity. You see a trend here. We get smaller capacities with faster performance as we go up, larger capacities with lower performance as we go down the stack. In a tiering scenario, what we do is we have some mechanism, and it could be manual. There's a lot of systems where this has been done manually, and people don't really necessarily think of it as a tiering mechanism, but you as a human could be part of the tiering system. But in a lot of cases, we have a tiering mechanism that determines what things should go at what tiers. And that may be something really simple, where you as a human simply tell the system, well, this workload has a high importance, so it goes to one tier, and this one has a different importance, so it goes to a different tier. Or the system may detect use cases and move things automatically, or some blending thereof. There may be some AI involved to figure out what things should be on what tier, and maybe it gets it wrong. Worth considering. What happens is things that are generally less important, such as file storage, might be moved to the lowest tier because it uses a lot of space, but it doesn't have to be hit really quickly. Things that are of high importance or have low latency needs, or a high need for low latency, depending on how you look at it, get moved to the SSD tier. Things like databases might run completely out of the SSDs. This is a pretty simple mechanism, or a pretty simple concept at least. It can be a simple mechanism, and provides a lot of power, and is especially good in situations where we need to have specific quality of service or service level agreements around our storage performance. We can guarantee that certain tiers are going to behave in certain ways, and so we can make sure that our database moves at a certain speed or whatever. And it's also nice using tiering. It's very simple with tiering to be able to specify workloads that are important versus not important. We may think, well, databases need to go fast and file storage needs to be slow, but we may have a situation where our database just doesn't matter. It's not an important workload, but our file servers are very important, and we may manually tell the system, I don't care what seems like should be the way it's set up. We want the files on the fast storage, and we want the database on the slow storage. That's a rare scenario, but certainly one that can happen. Caching works a bit differently. Caching has the same physical components, but instead of having some data sit on the fast layer and some data sit on the slow layer, all the data sits on the slow layer. Then some data, when it is requested or needed or predicted, gets put onto the faster cache layer. So caching is less effective in utilizing the capacity of the system, but it has multiple copies and has some benefits for speed. But it's a lot harder to predict exactly what it's going to do, so things like quality of service, and especially service level agreements, are more difficult to maintain. When requests come into a cached-based system, anything that's available from the cache gets handed out very quickly, and if the thing that's needed is not in the cache, then the system has to go to the slower layer to retrieve it, at which point it may be moved into the cache. Of course, the caching algorithms will determine this, and not simply me saying that that's how it's going to work. Your caching algorithm may work in many different ways. It may have some predictive analysis that even though something is grabbed off slow storage, it decides not to keep it in the cache. Caching systems have a couple benefits. One is they're incredibly simple to maintain. You pretty much just plug them in and go. If you need to speed things up, you just increase the size of any given caching layer and it will have more to work with. Caching is also really easy to have multiple tiers, such as RAM, SSD, and Winchesters. When going to tiering, well, we don't want to probably use RAM tier, so you generally only have 2 tiers because the other types of tiers become too volatile. With caching, we generally don't need to worry about volatility, especially in the read cache side. If you're doing write cache, we do have to worry, but we don't always have to do that. Or reads can be heavily cached, whereas writes go down to a lower cache layer that's less volatile. So tiering generally is more limited, but gives us a little bit more flexibility to control how it works. With tiering, you're generally going to want very large tiers, but fewer of them, whereas caching, you may have much smaller tiers. It is uncommon for your tiers to have, say, an SSD tier that's a very small percentage compared to your Winchester tier. Typically, your bottom tier will be a certain size, and then your next tier up may be 10 or 15% of that. With caching, it would not be uncommon to have a cache layer that may be only 1% or smaller than the layer beneath it. So in many cases, we can implement caching on a much more tight budget and make it a lot simpler, where each layer is just a tiny bit of the one above it. They work in different circumstances, and some things like databases may be able to be specified as being important and may get more cache preference than other things, but we're getting into really complex caching at that point to make that capability be there. So caching, simpler to implement and often more effective for smaller amounts of additional storage and gives us more potential layers. Tiering, we expect to put a lot more into fewer layers, and it requires a little bit more oversight, but we potentially can give quality of service guarantees and more manual intervention as to prioritizing what we want. They work in very different ways, they can be complementary, and you will find both of them in use in different products because they're both highly valuable and they both have their place, and in many cases you can kind of use them interchangeably, but they are very different mechanisms under the hood and do behave differently. As always, thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe, and you can put your comments below, ask your questions about cache and tiering, and you can ask about specific products, which ones they're using, do they have something else added in as well, and as always, you can sponsor us via Patreon. This episode of Sam IT has been sponsored by our friends at Talkadillo, the affordable, simple, fully managed, predictably priced VoIP PBX platform. Learn more at talkadillo.com and help to support Sam IT.